Okay. Hi, everyone. So today we are going to discuss altitude, which has quickly become sort of one of my favorite topics, especially living in Laramie and us being at that moderate altitude. Um, it's really fun as an exercise physiologist to study this phenomenon here. So at 7,000 feet, a saturation of hemoglobin begins to decrease rapidly. So this sort of causes this lack of oxygen, or this term known as hypoxia. However, there is a limit to how physiologically great our bodies are able to adapt. Do you have any guesses in terms of feet? What is the death zone where it's generally believed to be too high of an altitude for a person to live? And that is 26,000 feet is definitely considered to be too high of an altitude for a person to live. So here is just a graph to show us altitude in feet. We know that we have Denver, which is right around that 5,000 mark, and we know Laramie is about halfway between 5,000 and 10,000. I love this random like ski resort. I guess if you think of Breckenridge and some of the areas in Colorado, yes, that's right around 10,000 feet. Just about 18,000 feet is the highest human habitation. And then, so Mount Everest, that's at that like 32,000 feet. So that's why we say that the 26,000 feet really is pushing the physiological limits to be able to live and survive. So the literature will tell you that there are differing, I guess, definitions to defining high altitudes. Mid altitude is generally considered about 6,500 to 8,500 feet, whereas high altitude is considered about 8,500 feet plus. And obviously, if we're talking about going from 8,000, which is different than 15,000, 20,000, 30,000, so we're really kind of breaking this into very specific sea level, mid, and high, but we know that there's a lot of variation even between that. So understanding oxygen saturation, we discussed this briefly when we were talking about spirometry and ways to assess COPD. One of the ways was a pulse ox. And so this essentially goes on your finger. And typically 95 to 100% is average for the population. However, in Laramie, we're probably all about 91 to 94% blood oxygen saturation. So if you are in Laramie and you can get to 100, that's a physiological feat. That's pretty good. If you're less than 90, that's when we start to worry about underlying pulmonary issues or lung diseases. Maybe not so much in Laramie, but certainly at sea level. So, as many as 50% of people who visit high elevation resorts and tourist destinations suffer from altitude sickness. And I certainly even see that here in Laramie when I have friends come to visit who have spent all of their life basically at sea level. It does take some physiological adaptations to be able to feel pretty decent, even at our moderate altitude here in Laramie, Wyoming. So, look, if we're at about 7,900 feet, this is showing percent oxygen available. So we definitely see a decrease in our oxygen saturation the higher we go up in elevation. So again, this is looking at our altitude in feet and then our oxygen levels. So here we are in Laramie, should be around 80 or so. So the next time you go to the doctor and you have a pulse ox on your finger, and if you are in Laramie, I'd be curious, what that number is. So adaptations to altitude. So native Andean, this is around 22,000 feet, and Himalayan populations are around 29,000 feet. It's really interesting, some of the physiological adaptations that have happened in these population of individuals. So for the first one, they have better oxygen saturations at birth. They also have enlarged lung volumes. They have an increased capacity for exercise, as well as an increase in cerebral blood flow. And finally, they have a decrease in hemoglobin concentration. In addition to these factors, we also see a lower mortality rate from cardiovascular disease, and this is observed for residents at these higher altitudes. And we also know that there's a dose-response relationship that exists between increasing elevation and decreasing obesity prevalence, even in the United States. So there's this theory and there's this idea that even moderate altitude can kind of be a protective effect for, again, overweight and obesity and longevity. So the physiological changes at high altitude, with increasing ascent to high altitude, there's a progressive decline in the amount of oxygen in the ambient and inspired air, making gas exchange a little bit more difficult, which is why this can contribute to altitude sickness. So the Fick equation discusses cardiac output and tissue oxygen utilization, and this will be the next lecture. So just kind of hold that in your back pocket. But I do want to talk about exercising at altitude. So whenever we are exercising at altitude, we're talking about two different physiological stressors. Bet you can't guess them. Exercise and altitude. So these two different stressors are going to have an effect on performance. So typically we see VO2 max, which we've discussed is that like physiological sort of gold standard of oxygen utilization. So we can see a VO2 max decrease about 8 to 10%, even at Laramie's altitude. We will also see endurance performance decrease, and it will just have an impact on overall performance in general. We'll talk about anaerobic here towards the end of the lecture. There's kind of a caveat and some interesting things to think about. But the impact on overall aerobic performance means that if you were running a race lasting more than 3 minutes, you will not be able to run that as efficiently and as quickly as you would at sea level. And I have a few examples of that coming up. So there are actually systems in place to help us to sort of overcome and adapt to some of these physiological stressors that exercising at altitude causes. So our central nervous system, what it does is it makes rapid adjustments. Our endocrine system also makes adjustments with our hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, as well as changes to our cardio, our pulmonary, and our muscular systems to sort of overcome some of these physiological stressors from exercising at altitude. So let's go ahead and take a look. We've already reviewed this graph here, or the schematic on the right. So let's talk about this graph here on the left. So on our x-axis, you can see we have our partial pressure of oxygen. Then on kind of our two y-axes, we have percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, as well as oxygen content of whole blood. So let's go ahead and draw in here with our black. We're going to draw a nice kind of sigmoidal curve right here. And this is going to be our resting physiological state. And let's go ahead and put in our partial pressure of oxygen of our tissues at rest is at 40 millimeters of mercury. And you can look here where I got that. Down here for our tissues. And then our partial pressure for our alveoli is here at 100. So these are measurements at sea level. And I want you to keep this in mind as we talk about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So I have posted a video that I think obviously does a great job again at sort of animations and really explaining and outlining some of these harder concepts that I think are a little bit more difficult to understand. So please go watch that YouTube video and then come back to this if you haven't already. So let's talk about this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So what I want to do is draw our x-axis and our y-axis. So our partial pressure of oxygen in our millimeters of mercury. We'll put 40, 105. That corresponds with this graph up here. And then let's put in our percent of our oxygen. So let's do 25, 50, 75, and 100. So this also relates back to our oxygen saturation. So whenever you are 100% saturated up here at the top, that means that you have 4 hemoglobins on your oxygen. At 75, you only have 3. At 50, you only have 2. And then at 25, you only have 1. So let's go ahead and draw in our normal kind of sigmoid curve here. Remembering this is tissues. And this is our alveoli. And what we talk about here is the shifting of this curve to the right or to the left. So if this curve shifts to the right, that means that we have a decrease for the affinity of oxygen. So if this curve shifts to the right, we have a decrease of oxygen affinity. And there are several factors that can affect this curve. If you have an increase in exercise, an increase in altitude, and because of an increase of exercise, you have an increase in muscular temperature. And this can all affect the way that you have your relationship between your hemoglobin saturation with oxygen. Now, if this curve shifts to the left, if it shifts to the left, this means you have an increase for oxygen affinity. So say you're at sea level, you're at a more physiological sort of variable temperature, that 50, 60 degrees, or you are not exercising, meaning you are at rest. So again, please revert back to the YouTube video, but understand that this curve shifts depending on exercise, altitude, and temperature. So like we said, altitude can affect this curve. So the air is thinner, meaning the partial pressure of oxygen is lower compared to sea level. And then so you have to adapt to higher levels, especially as we talk about exercise. So these adaptations to high altitude, we know that populations living permanently at high altitude have greater main lung surface area, which we know is vital for gas exchange. And their oxygen dissociation curve shifts to the right, encouraging the release of oxygen into the tissues. So now let's bring this back a little bit more to the exercise world and talk about the effect of altitude on performance. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but one of the interesting things about altitude's effect on performance is that for short-term anaerobic performances, less than 10 seconds, you might actually see improvement. Whereas aerobic activity lasting longer than 3 minutes, you are definitely going to see a decline in your performance. So the reason why we've sort of come to this conclusion is that this individual set a new world record for long jump in the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. Now, the 1960s obviously was 60 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, something like that. Let me remind you that Mexico City is at 7,000 feet. So it's very similar to Laramie. And, back in the 60s, we didn't have as great of technology as we have today, training methods. We just didn't have a great understanding or as much understanding of physiology as we do now. And so it was very interesting to set this world record for a long jump. And one of the reasons for that is because of lower air density at this higher altitude. So biomechanical calculations indicated only a 2.4 centimeter gain at higher altitude, but when we're talking about elite athletes, in these scenarios, that can mean the difference between a gold and a silver medal. So again, in looking at 1964 and 1968 Olympics, the 1964 Olympics, and this is where we've gathered a lot of this information, and this really kind of sparked the interest in physiology and sports performance in the late 60s, and we had this boom in the 70s to really try to understand it because of the Olympics that they had in 1968 at 7,000 feet, and they were seeing all of these crazy numbers that we weren't expecting. So if you look at Tokyo in 1964 versus Mexico City in 1968, for the 1,500-meter run, so that's just short of a mile, in Tokyo, it took the men 3 minutes and 38 seconds, whereas it took the men in Mexico City 3 minutes and 34.9 seconds. So they actually didn't improve that much because of the altitude change. So over those 4 years, technology and training got better, but they still improved, but it probably wasn't as big of an improvement as we might have seen if those races were at sea level. So then this is what is interesting when you do get to some of the longer races, like the 3,000 meters. So that's almost 2 miles. In Tokyo, they ran 8 minutes and 30 seconds, whereas in Mexico City at the higher elevation, they ran 8 minutes and 51 seconds. So they did 21 seconds worse. And then as we progress up through the 5,000 and the 10,000 and the marathon, you can see that aerobic performance certainly declined in the 1968 Mexico City Olympics that were at that 7,000 feet. So from this, we know that we have a decreased VO2 max at higher altitude, primarily due to this lower oxygen extraction. So up to moderate altitudes, we will see a decrease in VO2 max due to a decrease in the arterial partial pressure of oxygen. And we'll also see decreased maximal heart rate at altitude as well. So these are some of the cool physiological changes that occur at altitude. So to summarize the effect of performance on altitude, shorter anaerobic, so we're talking, less than 10 seconds, are not negatively affected. And they might even be slightly better. Longer duration, more aerobic, you will certainly see a decline in sport performance due to the factors that we have discussed in this lecture. So there are some really cool concepts, and you're going to put these into play in your quiz for this unit, talking about these concepts of live high, train low, live low, train high, sort of playing with the elevation and altitude to make you as good of an athlete as you can be. So some athletes can improve their VO2 max by training at altitude, others cannot. A lot of this is due to intensity and the ability of the athlete to actually carry out some of these intense um, movements. I'm going to leave this a little vague because this really is what you guys are going to dive into and learn about during your quiz and sort of write up some summaries to this. So certainly use this, but also, Google and PubMed and things like that as well. So traditionally, we see an increased red blood cell mass that leads to an increased VO2 max if you live high and then train low. And so this tends to be one of like the more popular and sort of favorites in the exercise world. And like I said, this live high and train low, whenever you have hypoxic conditions for just everyday activities like sleeping, eating, just everyday activities, you can actually kind of up your physiological performance with training low because you can keep your intensity the same. So in theory, it's generally understood that the live high, train low is best for aerobic training. But like I said, I'm going to have you all dig into this a little bit more in your quiz. So I look forward to reading those answers, and definitely reach out if you have any questions. So how long does it take to acclimate? So you have a friend that's never been to Laramie, but they're a really avid runner, and they get here and they say, oh my gosh, I'm running so slow. This is so difficult. What is going on? As an exercise physiologist in training, what are you going to tell them? It takes about 21 days, about 2 to 4 weeks to acclimate if you are exercising. And it takes about 10 days if you are not exercising. So what I mean by that is it takes about 10 days to really truly not feel out of breath from just getting up out of bed and walking into the bathroom to brush your teeth, walking up a flight of stairs. So we've all been there. Have you been in Laramie and then you go somewhere for sea level for a few days or even a week, and then you come back to Laramie and you're like, why can't I breathe? What is going on? And so this obviously has to do with our acclimation to altitude. And so that concludes our lecture on altitude, and I will see you for the next one.